Good afternoon. Let me welcome you to this another part of our series, the IGSS lectures. Let me start with a story. I arrived in India in December of 2003. Shortly thereafter, elections were called, and they were called in February and held in late April and early May 2004. And one of the things I did as a new arrival to that great country was to try to follow as closely as I could those elections. So I did many things, but one of the things I did was watch television. And they had this one particular channel, NDTV, 24-hour news channels, and they had these one, sometimes 2-hour programs, panel discussions on the elections, electoral trends, voting behavior, what the different parties would stand for, and so on. And I said, this is a political scientist's dream, to have on television these extended, detailed, very sophisticated discussion about, voting trends and electoral behavior in the various states in India and so on. And the leading analyst in those panelists was none other than Yogendra Yadav. So this is how I was first exposed to him. And since then, I've continued to follow his remarkable trajectory. I would like to think we have become friends by now. We've been involved in many projects over the course of the past 5-6 years. Most recently, we were together in South Africa in a very ambitious project called A Global Conversation on Democracy and Democratization. So it gives me a very special pleasure to welcome Professor Yogendra Yadav on his first visit to Canada. He has been in British Columbia, has been in Ottawa, and is now in Waterloo. You may or may not have heard the phrase from Winston Churchill. I'm a great admirer of Churchill for his use of the English language rather than for any other reasons. But one of the things he once said is India is no more a united nation than the equator is. Now, Churchill may have been right about some things, but he certainly was wrong on that one. His notion was that India wouldn't hold and that it would fall apart. Well, it hasn't. Now, what is fascinating is that here you have this continent, really, more than a country, in South Asia, which has become the biggest democracy in the world, rambunctious, with issues, with problems, but robust. And many of the neighboring countries, smaller, more homogeneous, showing many of the features that theorists of democracy thought would make them more amenable to democratic continuity and stability, have been torn by strife in a way that India has not. Pakistan, as you know, didn't hold. It broke apart in 1971. Sri Lanka was torn by a civil war that lasted 25 years. Nepal has been riven by conflict in so many ways. So here you have this great paradox for theorists of democracy. Here is a country in which almost every condition that democratic theorists postulated, you need a big middle class, you need a certain level of development, you need a certain degree of homogeneity, all sorts of prerequisites, so-called prerequisites of democracy, which Seymour Martin Lipset, my former teacher, was a great propounder of. I was always a bit skeptical, I must say, of that line of thinking. But in any event, India has proven that quite wrong. And this is not happenstance. There is a reason for this to happen. And I mentioned to you last time that this book that has just come out, it's called Crafting State Nations, came out in January, published by Johns Hopkins University Press, co-authored by Yogendra Yadav and Juan Linz and Alfred Stepan, two of the leading comparativists in our time, questions the monopoly of the notion of nation-state in our thinking about how states are conformed, and put forth an alternative notion, the notion of state nations. And they argue that there are some multinational democracies, Canada, of course, is one of them, that take a different tack to what it takes to build a successful democracy. And they rely particularly on India and what India has done in the course of the past 60 years to build the biggest democracy in the world. And on that topic, I leave with you Professor Yogendra Yadav. You know his resume, a very impressive record. He was last year at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin. He has received many international awards for his stellar contribution to political analysis in India and elsewhere. He is the principal author of a book called The State of Democracy in South Asia, which takes a look at the 7 countries, published by Oxford University Press a couple of years ago. And as I said earlier, he is probably the leading commentator on Indian elections and voting behavior in the Indian media. So without further ado, I'll leave with you Professor Yogendra Yadav.
Thank you, Professor Heine. Your generosity and deep interest in thinking about politics, about democracy in different parts of the world has often surprised me. It's been a pleasant surprise and confirms a sense that we still have some minds who think globally, that accidents of birth do not necessarily restrict our vision. I should thank the Basilisk School of International Relations and the CIGI for giving me this opportunity. When Professor Heine mentioned this first to me, I honestly thought I didn't deserve this honor. These are things meant for senior academics. And I've not yet arrived at that seniority. But he's always been generous, not the least because he mentioned the 2004 election television coverage. And he's been a diplomat, and he diplomatically did not mention what kind of forecast was being made in those programs and how disastrous that forecast actually turned out in 2004. But that's diplomacy for you. Thank you. I talk about the rise of state nations. Unfortunately, the title is missing here in this slide. It's a subtitle which is presented here. Rise of State Nations, Diversity and Democracy in India. And the way I wish to go about making the argument is as follows. I begin by posing a general question and say something about why that question is important and has become far more important than it used to be. Then I present 2 dominant answers, or one dominant answer and one of its possible alternatives. What Professor Heine mentioned, nation state as the leading dominant paradigm and the possibility of another paradigm. Thereafter, I shift to the Indian case and I sketch what was the Indian model, how India went about dealing with diversity and democracy. I begin by sketching that model in some of its specificities, and then go on to look at some evidence of whether the model has worked or not. I look at some successes. I would present some empirical evidence to you to look at those successes, but I also look at some of the failures. And finally ask myself, what do we learn from India's successes and India's failures to think about diversity and democracy in our time? The question I wish to start with is very simple. How do modern democratic states deal with deep diversity? Why modern? The idea of dealing with the idea of coexistence of different religious social communities within a single political unit is not necessary to modern states. This existed prior to modern states. As my colleague Rajiv Bhargava would remind everyone, for the famous Indian Emperor Ashok, this is a principal concern for him. How to make sure that people who follow different religions live amicably within his kingdom. What does modernity do then to us? Modernity transforms this question in two fundamental ways. One, it transforms the nature of our identity. In pre-modern time, identities are fuzzy in the sense that there are no sharp boundaries between communities. What modernity does is that it brings in several templates, it brings in several instrumentalities which force us to make these boundaries very sharp. Boundaries between what it means to be Hindu versus what it means to be Muslim. Boundaries of belonging to one linguistic community versus another linguistic community. Language would be a classic example of that. As you traveled in any pre-modern community, your notion of whether you are German or you are French, there was a notion of being German, there was a notion of being French, but there was very large shaded zones which you passed through. It did not require you to say either or. It did not require you to draw a sharp boundary, which is what modernity does. It transforms the nature of our identity, asks us through instrumentalities like census, it transforms these communities into enumerated communities. Identities get sharply defined, very clearly focused. At the same time, modernity also ensures that these sharply defined identities are brought in juxtaposition with each other. They are made to confront each other in ways which pre-modern world did not need to. Through international transfers, through cultural flows, through flows of information, through migrations, everything is happening at the moment. So in a sense, modernity makes this question, a question that humanity has always lived with, this question into a much tougher question to negotiate, a question which has its presence all the time. What does democracy do to this question? Because the question of dealing with diversity within a single state is not necessarily a question that worries only democracies. Syria is worried about it. Bahrain is worried about it. United Arab Emirates is worried about it. What democracy does is that it removes one range of options to deal with deep diversities. And those range of options are simply eliminated. Today, we associate democracy with a certain minimum regime of rights. And given that, and if you wish to respect that, then certain ways of dealing with diversity which were available in the 19th century are simply not available in the early 21st century. It also does something else. It provides new set of instruments. Democratic politics based on universal adult franchise and open political competition also provides new ways of dealing with diversity. What it does, in some imperceptible ways, is that it makes the nature of identities politically negotiable. Maybe I'll have some time to talk about it when I look at the Indian example, how identities are gerrymandered through democratic politics and its negotiations. In other words, we are dealing with a question which is neither necessarily modern nor specific only to democracies, but modern democratic context transforms the nature of this question completely. Let me say a word about the two other expressions used here, state and deep diversity. There are many ways of dealing with diversity that need not respect boundaries of modern state. accepting multinational solutions, accepting disintegration of countries, what happened in Yugoslavia, is a response to diversity, except that in the last instance, it did not respect the boundaries of state. It involved redrawing the boundaries of the state. I'm at the moment interested. I do know that much thinking in multiculturalism sometimes takes us in the direction of full-blown multinationality, which is to say, let 1,000 flowers bloom, let 1,000 nations bloom, let 1,000 states bloom. We can have a discussion about it later on, but I just wanted to say to begin with that I would restrict myself to ways of thinking about resolving this question within the given boundaries of state. We can later discuss why this artificial limitation. I think it's a very important limitation, but I just wanted to place it before you right in the beginning. Finally, what is deep diversity? I have something very specific in mind in talking about deep diversity. There are all kinds of diversities that you see in modern world, but only some of those diversities have geographical concentration and have the potential of presenting itself as an alternative nation, potential of thinking of itself as a possible state. Those are the ones that I would call deep diversity. So the situation of Quebec in Canada, for example, is clearly an illustration of deep diversity. The position of Kashmir in India is clearly an illustration of deep diversity. Other kinds of diversities that we have, and there are so many, which do not lend itself to geographical concentration and aggregation in the form of alternative states, are not things that I would bring under deep diversity, because these are things which most states find some ways of resolving. It's only the question of deep diversity which poses a challenge to the idea of, to the boundaries of nations and states. And that's a question which is worth thinking about seriously. With these parameters then, I want to get back to the question we posed right in the beginning. How do modern democratic states deal with deep diversity? As you can see, my question has an empirical appearance, but has a moral normative slant to it. So how do they deal with it? Also has implicit question of how should we deal with it? These are both things that I wish to take on board. We do have one dominant way of responding to this question. And that dominant way invites us to think about a world where there is almost a perfect fit, a near fit between cultural boundaries and political boundaries. That is to say, how do you deal with diversities? Well, the way to deal with diversity is to draw political boundaries in such a way that each culturally homogeneous community has political unit of its own. Each nation, each culturally homogeneous community which is which exhibits characteristics of deep diversity has a nation of its own, has a state of its own. So each nation has one and no more than one state. Each state has within it one and no more than one nation. This is, artificially put, the paradigm of the nation state. In its cruder formulation, this is something which is unlikely to appeal to us. But it's astonishing to look at how deeply informing this particular paradigm has been of our imagination, how powerful this imagination has been in the last 150 years in shaping human beings' thinking about how collective political life should be led. Basically, this paradigm invites us to think of the existence of more than one homogeneous community within a single political boundary as a potential source of problem. So if you have more than one nation within a state, you're dealing with a potential problem. Or if you have one nation, say people like the Kurds, spread across more than one state, that's also a problem. So how do you resolve it? Well, you resolve it either by redrawing political boundaries. And you can see the history of 20th century is a history of attempts to draw redraw political boundaries in order to match a presumed deep cultural boundary. Or, if you can't do that, well, erase cultural boundaries then. How do you erase cultural boundaries? Well, you can erase cultural boundaries very softly by encouraging minorities to integrate. You can put some pressure on them to assimilate, or you can use laws and state power to coerce. And in the last instance, you have the option of ethnic cleansing. And the history of 20th century is a history of all these options having been exercised almost all over the world. So we're dealing with a subject which is not merely of limited academic significance. We're dealing with a paradigm which is not a paradigm that bothers some professors in universities. We are dealing with a paradigm that has gripped human imagination for a very long time. People have fought battles, killed each other to meet this theoretical paradigm of how political life should be led. My colleague Ashish Nandi insists, and I respect his calculations, that in the 20th century, more people were killed in ethnic violence than in the two world wars and all other wars of the states put together. This is the kind of subject that we are dealing with. This, in a sense, is the consequence of the power of the idea of nation state. We all feel uneasy about those consequences. But what do we do about it? Is there another way of looking at it? Is there another way of theorizing this? The work that Professor Heine mentioned, this new book that he mentioned, is an attempt to try and understand how we go from the dominant idea of the nation state to a different way of looking at it. Now, we've had two kinds of critiques. We've had moral critiques of the idea of nation state and the idea of nationalism. That has been quite prevalent all this time. Whether you look at someone like Tagore, I think of the Indian examples. In fact, one of the most ironic thing about Indian nationalism was that this nationalism was informed by a very deep critique of the idea of nationalism itself. Someone like Rabindranath Tagore, India's first Nobel laureate, who was considered an iconic figure by Indian nationalists, he actually wrote a small book in English critiquing the idea of nationalism. And he actually wrote to Mahatma Gandhi, the leader of our national movement, a series of letters to say, I thought you were a spiritual guru. I thought you were a great man. Why do you attach yourself to such parochial notions as nation and nationalism? And this is happening at the height of national movement. And both these are icons of the national movement. They're debating with each other whether they should associate with such narrow doctrines as nationalism or not. In other words, moral critiques of the idea of nation states have been around. What we don't have is an attempt to take that one step further and to actually say, it's not just in the realm of morality, but if you look at the real life practices of the last 100 years or so, there is actually an alternative model which has emerged from practices of different societies in dealing with deep diversities. What I would do today is to present one such case, namely that of India. But I do so not because I think Indian case is and ought to be the central case, but because I happen to be familiar with that. I'm sure someone could do that for Canada. I'm sure someone would do that for Spain and other countries. What we found, and the basic starting point, in a sense, the intuition behind this entire project, intellectual project, is the idea that in reality, while the idea of nation state dominated human imagination, in political practice, many parts of the world did work out very intelligent and complex ways of doing exactly what nation state prohibited us from doing, namely keeping more than one homogeneous political communities within a single unit, a single political unit, without this becoming a source of deep conflict, without disintegration. And that is a model which is based on recognition of diversities and differences. That model, and the contrast with nation state is this. In this model, you saw differences not as a problem, but potentially as a source of strength. This model encouraged diversities to be foregrounded rather than to be swept under the carpet. This model required that diversities to be acknowledged from the front door and be accommodated. We focused on those models, and we thought there is now a need to give this model a name, because that's how human imagination moves. You look at practices, there is an unease which takes forms of alternative practices, and there comes a stage when you wish to give that alternative practice a name and move that forward. Naming doesn't change the world, but it can possibly take us one step forward in trying to think of alternative arrangements. Names have a quality of reminding us of something all the time. So that's why we propose the name state-nation. Why state-nation? It's, after all, just a reversal of the two words used there. State-nation because while nation-state invites us to think of deep cultural boundaries which are pre-existing and which in turn have to be respected by those who do the business of state. The name state-nation invites us to think exactly in the opposite direction. It invites us to think of modern political boundaries which can negotiate pre-existing differences and actually accommodate that. Let me not go on and on with the theoretical difference. Maybe one way of capturing the difference between these two ideas is to look at their differences somewhat more systematically, schematically, as kind of ideal types. Ideal types in the sense that these are not differences you would see in reality clearly reflected in concrete cases, because not one case would fully fit any of these theorizations. But just to look at it schematically, in terms of pre-existing conditions, nation states are characterized by awareness and attachment to one single cultural identity, one cultural and civilizational tradition. You could see that in large number of countries in the world. Even today, you would, if you think of countries like Japan, if you think of countries like Sweden, you would think of, or Germany, you would still principally think of them as countries which have that characteristic. State nations, on the other hand, are countries which are typically characterized by awareness and attachment to more than one civilizational cultural tradition. There are, at the same time, this attachment to more than one cultural tradition, more than one civilizational tradition, does not preclude a possible identification with a single political unit. Now, this is about pre-existing situation in terms of state policies and how politics and policies relate to this. Nation states are characterized by homogenization. State nations are characterized by recognition of diversities, differences, of non-assimilationist integration. I'll come back to all this when I speak about India. In terms of institutional apparatus, nation states are typically unitary states. Sometimes they can be federal too. Think of Germany, or Austria. These are technically federal states, but these are nation states which have created federations more by way of administrative division. State nations are characterized not just by federation, but by asymmetrical federation. Asymmetrical federation, most of these are political science students, so I need not belabor the point. Asymmetrical federation is a federation that does not treat all the units within the federation equally, which works out unique solutions, different solutions for different places. The USA would be a typical example of symmetrical federation, where no matter how big or small you are, you get your 2 seats in Senate. India would be an example of asymmetrical federation in extreme. In its politics, nation states are characterized by absence of ethno-cultural or territorial cleavages. State nations are characterized by presence and salience of these cleavages. Nation states do not provide a play for autonomous parties. State nations allow, legitimize, and sometimes find even coalitionable, which is to say, parties which are autonomous parties are often given a share in central power. These are some of the characteristics. In terms of citizens' orientation, which follows somewhat from the pre-existing conditions, nation states are characterized by single identity and by obedience to the state and to the nation. State nations, on the other hand, are characterized by multiple but complementary identities, which is to say, the citizens say, yes, I'm Canadian, but with that, I have another identity too. And I cannot be asked to choose between these two. I carry more than one identity, and both these are my legitimate political identities. Multiple but complementary identities. This is typically the pattern of state-nation. Enough of theory and generalizations. I want to now come to India and speak about the Indian case. Just 1 minute for a thought experiment of the kind that John Rawls would approve. The thought experiment is this, that we happen to know everything about what happened in 20th century. We know all the relevant facts necessary to think about diversity, democracy all over the world. But somehow, because of some stroke of luck or ill luck, we miss out on one slice of our memory, which is what happened to India after 1947. John Rawls would call it a partial veil of ignorance, but I like to think of Bombay cinema, in which all these kinds of accidents routinely happen in every movie, and the whole movie then revolves around that accident. So John Rawls or Bombay cinema, you take your pick, but basically you happen to lose that one slice of your memory. But you know everything else. You know what India's demographics are. You know that the country has been partitioned on lines of religion in 1947. You know that the country has wide scape of languages. You could say 25 if you wanted to look at languages which have print culture of their own, languages which have some kind of recognition and intellectual culture around it, then you would stop with 25. But if you were a linguist, you would probably go up to 700. So depending from anything from 25 to 700, you have as much variety of languages as you would find, for example, in the whole of Europe, maybe more than that. You also know that this thing called Hinduism, which has 80% people in it, in 80% of the population, is actually characterized by deep divisions of caste. So it's actually, in a sense, pointless to talk about Hindus, because the divisions of caste with the institution of untouchability does exist. And in this experiment, you do know what happened to Yugoslavia, you do know what happened to Soviet Union, but you somehow do not know what happened to India after 1947. What is our best guess? If I look at the literature of that time, if I read sensible political commentators of that time, the conclusion is somewhat inescapable. Give it 15 years, maybe 20, this country will disintegrate. This was the most obvious, sensible conclusion. I don't think it was alarmist. I don't think it was nonsensical. It reflected the wisdom of its time. The wisdom of the time was that this country is characterized by deep misfit between cultural and political boundaries. It has mega political boundaries, which has within it at least 25 countries. It was a reasonable assumption to make in that time. That, as Professor Horke reminded us, did not happen. Therein lies a tale. The Indian national leadership took on a model which was a very risky approach at the time that they took it on, because it flew in the face of conventional political wisdom. Leaders of Indian national movement wanted to insist that India was a nation against Churchillian accusations. They wanted to insist that it was a nation. They obviously could not have pretended that this was a kind of a nation in the sense in which France is a nation, in the sense in which Germany is a nation, because there were linguistic differences, religious differences, caste differences. So they came up with somewhat innovative formulations of what it meant to be a nation. And the feature the phrase that captured it in India, and someone told me yesterday that this was actually the case in Canadian textbooks as well, so that delighted me no ends. The phrase that captured it in India was unity in diversity, which was almost the official slogan of the Indian state in dealing with these situations. This is what Indian nationalism did. Although the constitution was written between 1946 and 1950, but some of these fundamental decisions about what Indian nation was like and what form Indian democratic state will take were decided much earlier. In fact, one could argue that by early 1930s, most of these fundamental decisions were settled. That India was going to be a democratic state, that it was going to be a state which would not be nation in that classical sense of the term, that it would be asymmetrical, that it would not be assimilationist, and all these features were actually taken for granted. They were undertaking a very risky venture. They did not know it at that point, but they were creating a new model unknown to them. What was that model? The Indian model had the following attributes. Some of these attributes have to do with constitution, legal constitutional institutions. As I've already mentioned, and it now comes as no surprise to you, that asymmetrical federalism is one of the key attributes of this new model. Ironically, the word federation was never mentioned in Indian constitution. They knew about the word, they debated it, but they feared it. The country had just had partition. So in creating what is nothing except a federation, the word federation was kept out. And instead a euphemism called Union of India was used. India is a union of states. Anyway, forget the euphemism part of it. In reality, an asymmetrical federation was established, which was characterized by uneven representation of states, and UT is union territory. There are certain, shall we say, federally administered territory. That would be a closer approximation to the way you would look at it. Some territories are administered straight by the center, but these are very tiny and only a few now. States have uneven representation not only in the lower chamber but also in the upper chamber. More importantly, the constitution is full of specific provisions for different states. One of the most famous ones of these is Article 370 for the state of Jammu and Kashmir. I'll have more to say about Jammu and Kashmir later. But that single article effectively says that virtually nothing in the Constitution of India will apply to Jammu and Kashmir. If I could summarize that in one sentence, that's what the article means. But similar provisions were provided for several other smaller states of the northeast of India. Basically, the Constitution shows a deep sensitivity to differences. And Constitution itself provides for these differences to be accommodated. It also provided flexibility, apart from naming certain places and saying this place will have the following special and unique features. They also introduced two general things called Appendix Schedule 5 and Schedule 6 of the Constitution, which allowed, these are generic provisions for recognition of uniqueness which the Constitution makers may not have got, especially for the indigenous communities. It says the President of India has to simply recognize and by order notify a certain area to be an area inhabited by indigenous communities. And once notified, large number of laws and provisions of the union will not apply there, and independent arrangements can be made. So enormous flexibility is built in there in the Constitution. There is parliamentary form of government, I say it with this some hesitation now because I know I've not arrived in the right week in Canada to advocate parliamentary form of government and the beauties of coalition making. But having recognized my difficulty, what parliamentary form of government does is that it makes power into a shareable good. While we look at all other features of parliamentary and presidential form of government, I don't know why this attribute has escaped the attention of political scientists, because these two forms of government have direct relationship to possibility of accommodating diversity or not. Parliamentary form of government makes power shareable. And once it becomes shareable, of course, all kinds of corruption and everything else also creeps in. What it also does is that parliamentary form of government in the last instance is coalition requiring and coalition sustaining. Sometimes not so sustaining and requires collapsing as well. But its diversity consequences are actually very positive. So this is an attribute of the Indian system. And finally, in thinking in terms of constitutional provisions, in the Bill of Rights, which India had like most other democracies, there was a recognition of collective identities, recognition of religious minorities by name and special provisions for that. For instance, the Sikhs, and I mention this because I know this is a debate in Canada right now, whether the Sikhs can carry a little sword with them as a sign of their religious affiliation is something which is provided in India as a fundamental right of religious minorities. Right to carry sword, not the full sword. In fact, the smallness of size is also prescribed in the constitution. But you can carry a symbolic sword as a part of your religious rights. So recognition of collectivities by name in the constitution. Which are these collectivities? Religious minorities, linguistic minorities. Interestingly, the Indian constitution does not recognize any national language. Although even Indians believe that Hindi, which is spoken by 40% of the population, which is also my mother tongue, they believe that this is the national language, but actually Indian constitution does not recognize any language as national language at all. There is simply a list which is called the 8th schedule of the constitution, which began with 14 languages, has now become to 22. 22 languages are official languages of the union, and that's all. There is no special attention or special privilege to any one language. And there are special recognitions of disadvantaged communities, two communities specifically, the ex-untouchables, who are today called Dalits, and the indigenous communities, who are called Adivasis. The constitutional language for them is scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. There are special recommendations, reservations for them. Reservation not in a Canadian sense of the term, but let's say quota. Yeah, that's a North American expression. There are quotas for them in everything, in education, in parliament, in jobs, everywhere it provides for quotas for them. This was the constitutional package. The Indian model goes beyond the constitutional things and there's an element of policy, there is an element of politics. The element of policy is a policy of integration without assimilation. And this is where unity in diversity comes into play. In terms of the key symbols of Indian state, right from the national anthem. National anthem actually begins by naming places in the country. And in a sense gives you a message that India is all these places put together. So it actually does not begin by singing praises of some deep Indianness. It's actually naming of places, and recognition of diversity and differences is what it's all about. In terms of language and cultural policies, I've already mentioned the language resolution in the constitution. Even later on in the country in the 1960s, there was a very strong, there were linguistic riots in India about Hindi not being imposed on the rest of the country. And the government finally took that line, which has now become the official policy, which is to say English would be allowed to be used for official purposes as long as the non-Hindi states require it, which almost is in perpetuity. Now, whether it was a good resolution to the linguistic problem in terms of inequality is a separate question, and I have my opinions on that. But in terms of diversity and its accommodation, the fact remains that no one linguistic group can get up in the country and say, my language is the language of the nation. That idea was simply abandoned. In terms of politics, because no model is a model which can be invented purely by constitution. That's only the starting point of the game. The name of the game is in politics. And one of the crucial things that happened in India was recognition of regional political parties through the front door. This happened about 25 years ago. Parties which are state-specific, parties which actually draw most of their support from one state of the union, one province of the union, started coming up. Many commentators thought this was the end of the Indian dream, because you would have a party from Tamil Nadu, a party from Andhra Pradesh, a party from Punjab, a party from Maharashtra. Where is India? What's going to happen to Indian politics? In the last instance, however, if you look at it now, I don't think there was any, by then, pattern of politics was far too developed for anyone to even try to control it. It happened. But if you look at the overall consequences today, my sense is that these regional political parties have contributed more to national integration than the so-called national political parties. The consequences have been that because these regional political parties were given a front door entry and were provided a legitimate political play, then none of them took the secessionist route. They actually have become centric regional parties in the sense that most of these regional parties would wish to claim that they are not regional. They would have names like All India Anna DMK. The party is entirely limited to one state of the union, but they wish to pretend that they are All India something. Also, they enter into interlocking alliances, coalitions with polity-wide parties. There are two large polity-wide parties, the Congress and the BJP. And the pattern of politics of the last 15 or 20 years is such that most of these regional parties have interlocking coalitions. Interlocking in the sense, we support you in a national election, you support us to win power in a provincial election. And there are unequal terms set for both. It's a perfect interlocking alliance. Has huge consequences for corruption, which is going on right now in the country. It does, sharing power also means sharing booties of corruption, which has been happening at a very large scale. But that's not my story today. My story is only to look at diversity-related consequences. So accommodation of regional politics directly has had very beneficial consequences. So much so that there are two political parties which are on the borders of secession, which have been given a legitimate play in the national politics. One of these parties is in Kashmir, the other party is in the state of Nagaland. Both these parties they've not advocated secession, but they are known to be very soft on secessionists. But they have been given a legitimate, direct, open political play. Okay, now the question is, we've seen what they were trying to do. We know it was a tough situation. We know the set of practices they came up with. We know what was their solution. The question is, has it worked? I'll present a series of evidence very quickly so. You can look at the book later on. You can Google these sources and see what the evidence really is. But I'll quickly go through the evidence. My questions in a country like this would be, number one, do people have a sense of national pride? That's one question, because as I said, I'm not one of those who would say, let 1,000 nations bloom. That's not the way I look at it. State-nation in the last instance is both a state and a nation. Certain kind of political integration is important to it. So the question is, do people have a sense of national pride? This is evidence from World Value Survey. My point is not that India is among the top. My point is that the level of national pride is such that would not lead you to thinking about this experiment having been a failure. We clearly are looking at reasonably high levels of national pride compared to some other countries which we can see, and we can also guess why is it that in Germany, Switzerland, Belgium, and Austria, the level of national pride would be somewhat lower. That's 20th century history straight away playing itself out. So the point of the comparison is simply to note that something has happened. This is not a country which suffers from any lack of sense of national pride. A related question would be, do people have a sense of being Indian? The question about complementary, multiple but complementary identities. Look at the table, the column for all. 35% Indians have a sense that would describe themselves as only Indian, which is more than what they would in Spain or in Belgium. These are countries where this question has been tried, and these are countries which are state nations of a serious order. More importantly here, just look at Muslims and Sikhs, two large groups, which these are two religious minorities, and Muslims are a disadvantaged religious minority. So that's where my attention would immediately go to see, do they share that? Of course they do. So the only two conclusions I would draw from this table is a very large number of Indians, if you forget the top category of 35% and the bottom category of 12%, the remaining are the ones, that's about 40%, no, a little more than that, would mix some degree of state identity and some degree of national identity in describing who they are. And second is that in the case of minorities, where you would expect some kind of alienation, this identification with Indianness is, if anything, a little more than the rest, not less. It's less in the case of Christians, but that has to do with their demographic distribution in the country. Third question would be, what is the level of trust? Do people trust national, or do they trust only their provincial institutions? Or do they also trust some of these national institutions? Again, the comparison has other countries which are long-standing federal democracies. If you just look at those red highlighted figures, it tells you that compared to other long-standing federal democracies, Indian level of trust in the legal system, in parliament, political parties, central government, and civil services is pretty high. It comes as a reassurance to me that the level of trust in police is very low. Reassurance in the quality of data, that is to say, if the quality of trust in the police was also very high, I would be stunned, and I would begin to relook at the data itself, given the way Indian police works. And if you can take some delight in the Indian-Canadian comparison on police, and the level of trust people have in police in two different countries, which is actually a true reflection of what actually happens. The point here simply is to note that trust is extended not merely to local or provincial institutions, but also to national institutions. Finally, is there support for democracy? Because after all, democratic political mechanism is what holds it together, is what provides this opportunity. Do people have trust in that democracy itself? Here, it's a selective comparison with countries which have witnessed non-democratic regimes. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be nasty by including Chile in it. It just came. Some countries which have had non-democratic experience. This is the level of support. Red is bad news, blue is good. Again, the simple point is that this is not a country where a large number of people think that maybe we can do without democracy. Something of this diversity frame which has been guaranteed by democracy has worked. Does it hold true for all sections of society? That's a natural question which will come to mind. Here is a look at classic political efficacy question. Does your vote make a difference? Honestly, I'm always stunned to to see so many people who believe that their vote makes a difference. I don't know if my vote makes any difference. But the point here is not objectivity of it, it's perceptions, because nations and communities are created in minds and they're destroyed in minds. We look at this from 1971, 96, 2004, 3 points of time through the national election study which we conduct from CSDS. The simple point is that this sense of political efficacy has increased. More importantly, it has increased in every single disadvantaged group that we could possibly think of. These are all the groups which have been listed here. In every group, this sense of efficacy goes up. What's the point of this positive story? The point of this entire evidence is to simply say that this very risky experiment, which began in 1947, did succeed in some basic ways, not merely in holding the federation together. That we don't need surveys to find out that India is one single country even today. But that this is not merely a legal fact. There is more to it. Institutions, in terms of in terms of citizen subjectivities too, this experiment has succeeded in some fundamental ways. Are there no failures? Of course there are. And let me just speak for 2 or 3 minutes about some of the big failures before I close with some general observations. Kashmir is one of the best known, most spectacular and comprehensive failures. Comprehensive because through the last 60 years, it's only fair to say that people in the Kashmir Valley have remained unintegrated in the imagination of India. In precisely the kind of surveys that I quoted earlier, we've used the same surveys to ask tough questions in Kashmir Valley, and the answer has been somewhat flat over the last 12 years or so that we've conducted surveys in Kashmir, which is 4 out of 5 persons in Kashmir want to secede from India. They don't want to go to Pakistan, but they want to have an independent state of their own. Now, this is as comprehensive a failure as it can get. After 60 years, if 80% people say, we don't want to live in this country, that's bad. The question is it a failure of state-nation policies? Or is it a failure of inability to extend state-nation policies here? My argument is, if you look at Kashmir's history, it's an even more fundamental failure. It's a failure to extend minimum democratic conditions to that part of India. Kashmir has witnessed, although in constitution it was provided more autonomy than any other state of India, in reality, it has worked like a colony, a place where we've had military presence, where basic democratic rights have never been extended, elections have never been fair, except in 2002, and there have been some exceptions. Unfair elections dictated from top, puppet regimes being put from the top. This is lack of basic democratic conditions, which of course is not conducive to the state-nation policies at all. So the lesson I learned from Kashmir is democracy is an essential condition, is a necessary condition. Nagaland, similar tiny state on the northeast of India, refusal to integrate with India right from the beginning. What we have today is probably not that deep a sense of alienation as in Kashmir, but I would still say there is no deep relationship to India. What we have is a military stalemate. The rebels in Nagaland have got tired. Indian state has also got tired. And they are trying to work out their way to negotiation, which have ended up in a deadlock. But if you compare that to another state in the northeast itself, Mizoram, which presented itself with similar diversities, I hope you can look at the figures of diversity as well, how different these states are to the rest of the country in terms of its ethnic and linguistic composition. Mizoram had a condition which at one point was worse than Nagaland. The Indian state used Air Force bombing on its own people in the 1960s. But by 1987, the situation was reversed completely in Mizoram. And today, Mizoram is one of the most peaceful and integrated states of Indian Union. The lesson I pick up from Northeast is, if the initial moment is not impossible, then recoveries do take place. And recoveries take place only when a package of state-nation policies is extended. In Mizoram, the recovery took place because finally the Indian state said, all right, you run your own country, but agree to be part of India. They said, all right. So they used Schedule 6 to work out this provision. Virtually, large number of laws passed by Indian Parliament do not apply there. Of course, budgetary grants do go there. That's an arrangement. It worked. Punjab. For one decade, the insurgency appeared to be bordering on secession. And it seemed that Punjab was headed that way. Many scholars said it was a classic case of minority alienation resulting in secession. We take a very close look at that example in this book. The argument here is that Punjab is not the case of deep alienation of a minority religion, that actually the Sikhs had done better than the Hindus in almost every possible respect. There is very strong evidence of that. What we saw was a democratic breakdown, a classic democratic breakdown, in which the elite was playing its own too clever by half games, which resulted in a temporary breakdown, which allowed a recovery in 1996. And the recovery has been as spectacular as was the collapse. I could get into specific questions when we ask later. Let me summarize this entire story so far. Diversity and its relationship to democracy is no longer a question which concerns some peculiar societies, as was imagined 50 years ago. 50 years ago, the dominant wisdom was that there are normal countries where homogeneity is the norm, and then there are some peculiar countries. I'm sure they must have thought of Canada as one of those peculiar places where there's too much of a mix. Today, it's time to reverse that assumption and to begin to think that countries like Japan, Sweden, some other European countries may actually turn out to be something of an exception in human history. That actually the global situation would be of lack of fit between cultural and political boundaries. And that this is actually not so bad a news, because there are ways in which these two things can be brought together in ways which are profitable both for democracy and for sustaining diversity. In order to do so, now while in reality the question of diversity has expanded, it has started attacking even Europe. When Switzerland has those laws about minarets, the question of diversity is hitting very hard in all places where people never expected it to come. While the question of diversity is expanding all over the world, our imagination is not expanding in a corresponding way. This is what we need to do. We need to expand our moral and political imagination to keep with the changing realities of our time. State-nation is one possible paradigm of thinking about it. I do not mean to say junk nation states in Japan, junk nation state in Sweden. These are decent practices, they've worked. I'm also not saying adopt state nation everywhere else. We don't know sufficiently about the world. Our notion of the world still is very limited to probably half the world even now. We would have many practices of different kinds. And I do not mean to suggest that Indian case provides you with a recipe book which can be applied everywhere else. If European and North American recipes, European and US recipes have not worked in the rest of the world, there's no reason why Indian recipe should work in the rest of the world. It's just a way to expand our imagination, to begin to think in ways which are diverse and rich, to keep with a reality which is diverse and rich. This might also achieve something else in the process. This might shift the locus of democratic theory from a tiny part of the world, Europe and US, to most of the world. Because while democracy has expanded to all nooks and corners of the world, our notion of what it means to be democratic has not expanded. To do that is one of the biggest challenges of our time. And by thinking of something like state-nation, we can begin to take a small step towards doing democratic theory in a way which is democratic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yogendra. I'm reminded of one of the things we've talked about on democratic theory with Yogendra. There's this remarkable paradox that a small town in the northeast of the United States, which is New Haven, has been seen as sort of the model of what democracy should be for the world, for a simple reason that we have universities there and so on. Know that political scientists like Robert Dahl have written extensively on political practices in New Haven and how that should sort of be seen as a paradigm for the rest of the world. And the biggest democracy in the world, which is India, is somehow seen as odd and sort of an outlier. And to expand our imagination is what Yogendra and I are looking for. Questions? Yes, Lucy.
I'd like to ask you a question on theory and a question about India. The question on theory, actually, fortuitously, we mentioned New Haven, professor at Yale, Professor James Scott, and his work on seeing like a state. In your presentation, I think you would say that the dependent variable in your analysis was the notion of the nation, whether it was the nation state or the state nation. Dr. Scott argued very strongly in Seeing Like a State that the real variable was the nature of the state itself and its relations with people. And that he cites one very powerful statistic, which is that the state, in its manifestation of its own power, killed more than 80 million people in the 20th century. He also is very tough on the nature of the state in India, particularly with foolish projects such as Chandigarh and much more drastic projects such as the damming of river valleys and communities. So I wonder if you would talk about that other variable, the state, and how you see that within the model. Within India, going back to the elections that were cited earlier, at that time, there was a lot of discussion that economics were actually creating two nations within India for the first time. The successful India, the India flourishing that you could see largely in the west of the country and in the south, and the declining India, the part that was going into an economic stall, and that where people were feeling increasingly like their options were being compromised, which was the Northeast. This was not a national issue, it was an economic issue. And again, I'd be interested in your comments about economic, the role of economics and I guess issues of economic equity in the ability to maintain a sense of national unity.
Did you say north and east or northeast?
Well,
because that has different meanings in India.
It does. I was thinking really
Northeast
Bihar.
is that triangle towards the east,
Yes.
but north and east would be northern India and eastern India.
I'd say from Bihar to the
Yeah.
east, that whole area where the economic statistics are generally in a state of decline.
Yes, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you. The second one is easier to respond to because all I have to do is to agree with you. I think you're absolutely right. The challenge to integration can come from in two very, very different forms. One which we are used to looking at, namely through ethnic and cultural differences, which has torn many countries apart. And the point I was making today was that on that score, India has not done too badly compared to what it was expected to do. On the question of economic inequalities, the situation is pretty bad. If we are looking at class divisions and general inequalities, it's a country which has officially recognized quarter of population below what they call poverty level, which is almost a hunger level, couldn't possibly claim much. And it's true that much of this discussion about India shining and great Indian economic progress is something which is confined to a very thin upper crust of the society. But more relevant to our point today, you're right to say that there's also that economic growth of the last 2 decades has meant growing regional inequalities, where, broadly speaking, north and east of India has done much worse. I mean, the human development indicators of northern and eastern states would be comparable to the worst of the, not the bottom category, but bottom but one category of the UNDP human development rankings. But if you look at southern and western states of India, the human development indicators would more be of the middle income category of the UNDP. So there is a possibility of these inequalities coalescing and taking a political form. They have not as yet done so. I mean, your question has both orientations in it. One, this inequality is a serious problem in itself. Second, it has consequences for integration and political integration. As yet, it has not taken forms which can challenge political integration. But if you asked me what is the single most important challenge for the next 20 years or so, I would without hesitation name this: the growing regional inequality. The northeast of India has a very peculiar demography and economy. So actually in the last 20 years, northeast, the hill states of northeast India, which have had ethnic diversity and so on, and have had abuse of human rights, but they are not the poorest states. In terms of economic inequality, they have not done too badly. So that's why I just kept that out. On the first question, let me translate that somewhat differently. Someone could say, why is it that when you try to be so bold, why are you so timid then? Which is to say, you want to go beyond the existing models, but you stop at the state. I do so in a recognition which probably is a somewhat conservative recognition. But the recognition is that boundaries of what we call state are here to stay. If I were to do an exercise in normative thinking about an imaginable world, I would probably think occasionally of setting it aside. But when I think about the world as we look at it, I cannot afford to overlook the fact of these political boundaries across which we need visas, across which most of human imagination is bound, and most of human communities are bound by these boundaries, which also take a certain national expression. The idea of nationalism, the idea of a political community which calls itself a nation, around which it's not just in football matches and cricket matches that this gets expressed. It also gets expressed in very deep sense of who human beings are. We unfortunately, probably unfortunately, live in times when these boundaries, not just formal political boundaries, but also boundaries of imagination, are here to stay for some time. I can't think of these boundaries being erased in my own lifetime. Therefore, to try and see what best can be done within these boundaries is, to my mind, a very important political project. So I would agree that this project suffers from this limitation, but that probably makes it a little more relevant for the world that we live in.
Next question. Yes.
As you were speaking about the state-nation, I was thinking of another concept that took on the notion of the nation-state. And so in a sense, you had the same foil as Benedict Anderson writing about nationalism. And it's been some time since I've read this book, but and so I don't remember what he said about India in particular, but he also very much rejected the idea that sort of the natural condition was to have these pre-existing nations that then one shaped states around. But in his talking about an imagined community, what he really stressed was that when you started with the state, that what the state did was, and he was arguing historically as much as anything, had a historical project then to create a sense of nation around its stateness. And you, in contrast, talk about, you start with the state and move to diversity. And so I guess my question for you would be, is that a choice that states make to either try to create an imagined community of unity of the kind that Benedict Anderson talks about versus acknowledging and embracing diversity as India did? Is that a choice of states? Or if not, how do you account for those different critiques of the nation state idea?
A project like this one very much draws upon that historical scholarship of the kind that Benedict Anderson represents. A critique of that notion of the correspondence of political and cultural boundaries took place in various social science disciplines. You've had solid work critiquing critiquing the autobiography of the nation states, which has been done. You have very good work in sociology and anthropology about the notions of identity and how false these notions of identities were, which were being paraded in the name of nation state. What you don't have is sufficient literature on the institutional political arrangement, somewhat political scientist-y sort of subject, to think of what kind of political institutional arrangements are best suited to encourage that alternative kind of thinking. And I would like to see our work as trying to fill that gap, which builds on much of that work. It is true, I think it's a very good description that you provide of states creating a sense of nationness around, the attempt to create a sense of nationhood around a pre-existing state, which is in many ways what state nations do. Instead of saying, here is this racially pure community, and our state happens to express that, what they do is that they take very much an unfinished and messy project, which happens to land in their lap, and then try and create a sense of we-ness around that. Now, this has been seen as a somewhat, that these attempts are made has been recognized by many scholars. It has been seen to be a somewhat artificial and clumsy project. What we try and argue is that actually this somewhat artificial and clumsy project is at the heart of politics, that this is very much a political project of our times. You have various kinds of expressions. Someone like Habermas would talk about constitutional patriotism, which is an attempt to create a we-ness that does not derive from a deep cultural essential categories, which is in different ways, this is what most of the state-nation projects are about. And we think there's something really positive about that.
Next question. Yes.
Just wanted to start by saying thank you very much for your presentation, and I've enjoyed the way you've translated the Indian context for us Canadians as an audience. You've done a very effective job of making things make sense. And I just wonder if you can maybe, you seem to be familiar with the Canadian system and with the way parliamentary governments can and cannot work. And you alluded to Canada's current impending another crisis that's about to happen. And do you have any insights as to what it is about the Indian context and coalition building and power sharing within government? Something in India makes that work, or at least they're willing to do it again and again and again as a way of forming governments. But in Canada, we seem to be averse to even trying a power sharing coalition. I'm just wondering if you can share any insights as to what makes that a viable option in India, and maybe what do you think is preventing us from being more experimental in that sense in Canada? Or maybe you just don't want to try.
I have no insight to offer about Canada. I'm here to learn. And if the project of, if in a sense the spirit of the project is to oppose a colonial imagination which picked on a few sites in the globe and then extended their lessons all over the world, then the least I should do is not to do the same for India, to pick Indian lessons and apply it to the rest of the world and everything and anything. The only thing that, and then number two, how smoothly coalitions work is a function of the distance from which we look at it. So when you look at it from Canada, the Indian coalitions might look to be more smooth than they actually are. Every coalition all over the world is subject to pulls and pressures and to all kinds of negotiations, bargaining, and all such thing. And because if we live in that society, we get to see the information about all those tensions in a very fine-grained texture. And if we live away from that society, it comes to us only when there are volcanic eruptions. Otherwise, it doesn't make news. So that's why it's a function of the distance. Living in India and reading every day about the kind of pressures and tensions all these coalitions undergo every day, I would find it difficult to look down upon the Canadian tensions and problems. Having said that, one thing that surprises me is this, and maybe you have an answer to this, I have none. In what has surprised me is when I looked at some of the elections as to how the polity-wide parties were almost exiled from Quebec. Now, in the inability, in the Quebec question specifically, inability of a deep, what I call interlocking alliance to be developed with polity-wide parties and Quebec-specific parties. It's my question, why has that alliance not emerged? Because politically, it would make perfect sense for someone to say, I look at the rest of the country, you look after Quebec, we have this deal. When we have local elections, I'll give you whatever 5-10% votes I have in Quebec. When we have national election, can you give me 1/3 of your votes in national elections? It's a deal that can be struck. Why that deal has not worked is something that has surprised me, but I don't have answers to this question. It's just a question.
It may be that the answer to your question there is it did work that way in Quebec. Mm-hmm. It just looked like it was all within the context of a single party because you had a federal Liberal Party and you had a Quebec Liberal Party that functioned more or less that way, and that was the nature of the deal for a very long time. So it's one possible answer. But my question is actually about, the question. So you've framed the discussion around the puzzle that certain countries don't experience a violent dissolution even when they exhibit deep diversity. And I guess I want to ask, why isn't the puzzle, why do states violently fall apart when they experience conditions of deep diversity? And if we look at that as the puzzle and say that the default expectation is continuity, inertia, grounded in the human nature assumption that animals don't like change, and if you're going to violently disrupt a functioning governance arrangement, you're really going to have some compelling reason to do it. You're not really going to probably want to do it. Then it's not clear to me that democracy is a particularly powerful part of an explanation for that puzzle, because on the one hand, a democratic polity provides the ideal conditions for people who want to secede. It's in a democratic context that you actually have politically legitimate tools at your disposal to articulate secessionist aspirations and to express in a legitimate way a collective desire to do that. So if it's the permissive condition for secessions, and yet you're arguing it's the necessary condition for effective unity and creation of states, nations, probably the action is somewhere else. We would have to look not to the the governance arrangements to explain the other puzzle, or the flip side puzzle, but as something else. And in the case of the violence associated with redrawing boundaries in Europe in the 20th century, you could probably make a pretty good case that the real culprit there was this stupid idea of the nation state in the first place. I mean, people were being sold
Sorry,
that
nation state in the?
as the idea of the nation state as an ideal. It's probably the culprit. And we should probably blame Woodrow Wilson for a lot of this, right? Because people were being told that this is a good idea, and that different groups have legitimate political aspirations to territories and states of their own. And in practice, it was impossible. But once you sort of raise that expectation and you destabilize people's understandings of, that yesterday's functional governance arrangement is feasible today and it'll be feasible tomorrow, that's when you had this disastrous series of events that resulted in all these millions of deaths that make us think that the puzzle is, why do states stay together? When in fact it may be the opposite puzzle.
I'm trying to there are many questions here. To take one aspect of it as to what role does democracy play in this particular thing. I think while we recognize one aspect of what democracy does, namely democracy provides you open democratic competition and universal adult franchise, provides you much more room to articulate notions of statehood and competing nationhoods than you would presumably have in non-democratic regimes. On the other hand, democracy also provides something else, and part of my argument is to say that we should look at that closely. And in fact, your question becomes an occasion for me to highlight something I should have talked about, namely that democracy, political competition and universal adult franchise also provides for ability to transform identities. And in the Indian case, this is exactly what has worked. My own sense is that if India was not a democratic state, then I don't see how India could have held Mizoram, Nagaland. In fact, most of the north, I doubt very much if the northeast of India would have stayed with it. Why? One, democracy provided the very messy democratic contestations and very impure coalition building that takes place within it, which is constantly fragile, changing all the time. It provided for a certain learning possibilities which do not exist in a non-democratic regime. More than one, for me, Punjab would be a classic case where democracy made possible certain learning. The rulers the central government ended up taking positions which were lunatic positions. And in a non-democratic state, the Indian government would have had no option except to continue. Having taken a very hard position on Punjab, they had no exit route left for themselves. They would have just gone on and on and on. And Punjab's situation would have possibly ended up in a secession. Democratic political negotiation provided for an opportunity for the regime to learn, to be able to take steps backward. That's number one. Number two, democracy also provided for an occasion for transformation of identities and reimagining what popular identities are. In a non-democratic setting, the possibility that something like the identity of the Mizo, for example, or identity of many other dominant groups would become singular, solidified identity. But what democratic politics does is this practice of holding elections every 5 years and the requirement of manufacturing majority, which mostly is ethnic majorities, it invites people to rethink about who they are. And very often, and I can't get into very specifics here, in large number of Indian states, people actually begin to rethink what their identity is in order to fit into the logic calculus of political competition. This, to my mind, has been a very healthy feature. And thirdly, democracy has provided for a situation in which even the smallest, especially democracy of the last 20 years, which is dominated by coalitions and so on, has provided for a situation where even the smallest of Indian states have become crucial to the way central power has been wielded. This again has made for a certain integration. So while democracy provides a forum for articulation of grievances and possible secession, it also provides for these self-corrective mechanisms, which have worked very strongly. I don't know if those mechanisms would have worked in the absence of democracy. That's one part of your question. The other part is the puzzle posed correctly at all? Should we not ask the question about why certain regimes collapsed rather than why certain regimes have survived? I'm still trying to think about comparative advantages of framing these questions in these ways. In fact, our sense when we started on this project was that in fact a lot of scholarship has been produced on these cases of collapse and failure. And where you so beautifully summed up the problem. The problem is actually this dominant notion, the whole idea that if you want to make any claims to political power, they have to be couched in the language of an alternative nation, and therefore would need to go beyond boundaries. Our sense was that we actually do have decent scholarship on these questions. And what people have not done so far is ask another question as to why certain countries have survived the way they have. And I personally do not see why we should not think of these two questions as complementing each other and insights to be brought together, something that we have done in the book, to look at the Yugoslavian case and to draw lessons from that. It's not quite clear to me why we should see these two questions as competing questions. But maybe I didn't fully understand the thrust of your point.
Very good. I think we're running a bit behind.
Sorry, I'll be shorter now. You're sure.
Yeah. We have some excellent questions. So, without further ado, let me give now the floor to Dr. Andrew Thompson, who will say the vote of thanks.
Oh, thank you.
Dr. Yadav, thank you so much for that presentation. And I mean, there's a saying that foreign policy is an extension of domestic policy. And I was struck by your discussion of India in the late 40s and the constitutional experiment. And if you look at the UN records at the UN Human Rights Commission, India is really exporting these or promoting these same principles at the UN. And I think the contributions to international human rights law that India made, and the Indian diplomats are all over the records, is really, really quite astounding on issues of things like a federalist clause in the covenants, the right to self-determination. There was a very strong movement that had a very nationalistic interpretation of the idea of the right to self-determination, that it was all about sovereignty. And it's, in fact, Indian diplomats who are offering a much more moderate interpretation of that phrase that favors accommodation. India was the biggest proponent of the right to individual petition for human rights violations, and of course was leading the charge on issues of racial discrimination as well. So, I mean, I think your presentation, is quite striking in that, in fact, India's contributions globally to this understanding of the state nation are there in the historical evidence. So, and I think you made a very compelling case that not only the Indian model, but this idea of the state nation is one that is definitely worth taking seriously, because, as you note, the alternatives, particularly extreme forms of conflict, are highly undesirable. So thank you very much for that presentation.